Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Eric Wise. Based in the greater Cleveland area, Eric is a software architect turned learning expert who has founded and led 2 successful companies and discovered that his true calling is creating learning experiences that leave a lasting impact. You can follow him on Twitter at skillfoundry.io and check out his website at skillfoundry.io and subscribe to the Skill Foundry channel on YouTube at skillfoundry.io. Eric is the author of the book, Effectively Learning to Code, A Brain-Based Approach. In the book, Eric offers readers a comprehensive guide that bridges the gap between cognitive science and coding education. The book offers a unique perspective on mastering programming, combining science on how the brain works with practical learning strategies, and providing readers with a scientifically grounded approach to becoming proficient coders. In this interview, we're going to talk about Eric's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk about his experience as a content creator and a book author. So thank you very much, Eric, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
No, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into a career as a programmer and entrepreneur.
Yeah, I grew up in Ohio, USA. My dad was he worked in the nuclear power industry. He was a control room operator. But I was fortunate enough at the time to get exposure to the Atari gaming system. And then my dad bought a Commodore 64 computer. And I was hooked. I wanted to start learning to code because I wanted to create games. That was my original thought. As I got older and I got more experience and I started really looking at the gaming industry, unfortunately, they don't treat their line workers very well. And I was like, I don't want to get fired every time I ship a product. So I'm going to go into business programming instead and maybe dabble in games on the side. And that was a very ambitious goal that did not happen with family and other commitments. But I had a very successful career in business programming, still doing a lot of consulting work, enterprise architecture, things like that.
And can you talk a little bit about what these successes were like? What kind of work were you doing?
Yeah, the interesting thing about my career is that I started out kind of big. The company I got a job with out of college was a accounting software firm, and they got acquired by a company called Great Plains, which did financial accounting software, and then Microsoft acquired them. So kind of by accident, within 9 months of graduating college, I ended up working for Microsoft for a bit. But then eventually, as the M&A stuff started to finish, they came around and they interviewed everybody for their jobs, and they said, "Hey, if you want to keep your job, you got to move to Great Plains headquarters." And I was like, "Oh, where's that?" And they're like, "Fargo." And I was like, "No, I'll take my severance. Peace out." And then, I ended up working for a lot in the healthcare space, a lot in the insurance space, banking, finance, retail. And I ended up working for smaller and smaller companies because the better I got at coding and the better I got at designing applications, the more impact I wanted to have. And so moving to smaller companies allowed me to have kind of an outsized voice for my experience level. And then eventually I went all the way down to startups and I started building things from scratch, from the ground up. And that was where I had to build teams on a budget. And when I had to do that, I had to hire a lot of people out of college. I had to hire a lot of interns, and I ended up doing a lot of mentorship, and I really enjoyed that teaching and collaboration.
And I'm really interested in talking to you about mentorship and stuff like that. And it's so interesting to hear about the way you learned it and you tell that story so clearly. What was it like? Did you take the transition from like coder to manager kind of very easily, or was that something? Did you read a lot of books? Did you have a mentor of your own?
I was always a technical manager, so I never became, the manager people talk about that doesn't touch the technology anymore. I basically learned the hard way, through experience, making mistakes. I was always a very transparent person, so I learned that not everybody is like that. I learned a lot about tact and how to deliver bad news and how to mix in good feedback and kind of strike that balance. And it was a rough learning experience at first. I don't envy people who had to work with me early on because I was kind of demanding and wasn't great at bedside manner, I guess you would call it. And that's just something I developed, especially as I got into leadership and I had to start meeting with non-technical stakeholders and going to things like that. I was always a good communicator. It's just the message wasn't always the best. So that was a tough learning experience. But I got there, and I think people enjoy working for me today a lot more than they used to.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's clear that the sort of like reflecting on your own behavior and like where your situation is a really important part of your approach to things. It's very evident from your book. And yeah, so and at a certain point you found your way into making, kind of learning content and things like that for people, being a content creator. You've got this great YouTube channel with really good videos. By the way, I recommend it for anybody. Even if you're not like a coder, like there's like, if you're interested in learning about these things, just, in sort of easily digestible, clearly presented kind of bites, like it's a really good resource for that. How did you get into creating? Did you start with videos? Did you start with, blog posts?
So I actually started doing training for certification programs. So I would kind of freelance on the side while I was doing my full-time job and teach like a SQL course for Microsoft certification or things like that. And in those courses, they give you all the materials. And in my college experience and my post-college experience and in my certification experience, I was like, wow, there's some good content out here, but a lot of this content is really bad and just not effective. And, I started to dabble with building my own content. It started with a blog. That blog doesn't exist anymore, but I joined like 5 other coding guys, and we had a blog site back in the day. And then, when I left my regular job and started a coding boot camp, I had to build all of that content from scratch. And that was my first time, doing something at that scale. And I realized, and this is something that I see a lot now that I'm more educated, I took the time to study learning science. And a lot of people who teach things, not just in development, but a lot of people in general who try to get into online courses and stuff, they don't take the time to learn about how learning works. And then you see them deliver content that isn't very effective. It's, it's all video. It doesn't have enough hands-on. And, when I went down that rabbit hole, it became kind of a part of how I approach things. And it's always starting with the end in mind. What do you want somebody to do? So I start with the end project, and then you build backwards from there to give them all the support to build that project. And there's a lot of techniques like that, active learning, spaced repetition. If you go out and research learning science, you can find that stuff. And I tried to build all that in my courses and a bit into the book that I published too. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm looking forward to talking with you about science, and that's again, that's sort of what I was saying about, you sort of like, you're obviously, as a part of your approach to things is just to take a step back and reflect, like, what am I doing here? And it's so easily, specifically if there's something about and you're passionate about, and you want to write like, oh, I wish this is the kind of thing I wish I'd had when I was starting out. It's often you think that's sufficient, and sometimes it is, but taking a step back and thinking about, how is it that people learn? What is it that they see when they're looking at what I've created? How are they interacting with it? Things like that can be really important. So just moving on to talk about your book and brain science and neuroscience and things like that. You talked about how learning about these kinds of things isn't just for sort of brain scientists. They're doing it for a reason, which is to understand how the brain works, which it can be very useful for the rest of us. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the brain's learning process and what you learned about that and how you apply it in your learning materials.
Yeah, a lot of what I was digging into when I was learning about this was just how the different parts of the brains interact with each other, and specifically how things move from short-term memory into long-term memory. And the interesting part about it is I wasn't surprised.
Yeah.
We don't think about it enough, but I wasn't surprised. It was like, wow, if you space out and repeat practice over time, you'll learn better. You'll retain things better. And it's just something, the impetus for the book was really, I encounter so many people who are learning to code. And they're at various stages and various frustration levels, but coding is one of those things that you can pick up on your own with online courses, by reading books and things like that. But the other thing about coding and engineering and getting into the brain is that a lot of people who pursue this field, and engineering in general, are gifted students. And I don't know how it was for you in school, but I didn't have to study that hard. I didn't have to apply myself that hard. And I see that in other people. They never really learned how to learn, and they never learned those good habits. But something like coding that requires deep knowledge, that requires, this type of practice. You hear this phrase called tutorial hell out on Reddit, where people are learning to code and they're like, oh, I've been following all these tutorials all the time and I can't do anything. I can't build anything. I'm putting all these hours in and it's not effective. What's going on? And inevitably, when I talk to these people, they're not taking notes. They're not designing projects. They're not doing spaced repetition. They're passively watching videos instead of actively learning. So a lot of this part of the book is just, hey, here's how the brain works and how things move from short-term memory into long-term memory. And here are some habits you can use to facilitate that process, like note-taking and journaling and, how to set up an environment. Like I always tell people, put your phone down. Turn off the alerts, turn off the notifications. You got to focus on coding. You want to get into the flow state. You want to get into deep work. You can't do that if your notifications are buzzing every 30 seconds with TikTok videos, and that's kind of where the book came from and what I was trying to bring together.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm actually quite interested in talking to you about this sort of repetition and spacing, for example. But yeah, what it was like for me in school was basically, no, I didn't have to study. It's my sort of very, very bad habit that I developed early on was I specifically remember like realizing that what the teacher was doing was just reading the chapter content out and then assigning questions 1 to 51 odd, because that's in my day, that meant the answers were in the back for the odd, not the even questions in the back of the textbook. Oh, there we go. So what I would do is I would be, kind of like starting when I was like 9, I think I'd be like, oh, I just made it a race. Like I'm going to try and answer all the questions before the teacher stops speaking. Mm-hmm. Ever since then, I've always, and like, I was particularly sensitive to like doing well on tests and stuff like that. So ever since then, I've had these very bad habits of making everything a race, and feeling like I have to get it right the first time. Both of which are very bad for learning.
Right. But a lot of school, today is broken down to just regurgitation. So it's just memorize, regurgitate, forget. Memorize, regurgitate, forget. Well, coding is a skill. And you can't memorize, regurgitate, and forget a skill. You have to practice. And I just sometimes early on in my journey, I would get kind of frustrated talking to some people because they had these bad habits, and I liken learning something like coding to learning to play an instrument like the piano. And you could watch YouTube videos on people playing the piano very well all day long, and you will never get good at playing the piano. The only way to get good is to put your hands on the keys. And how do you learn a song? If you've ever played an instrument and tried to learn a song, you just go one measure at a time, and you have to practice this measure 50, 100, 150 times until you get it right. And that's kind of what I build in my courseware and stuff. You're always, I'm going to show you something. We're going to do it together. You're going to do it yourself. And then eventually there's going to be a capstone, and you're just going to keep using those skills over and over and over again. And I get highly frustrated sometimes. I never, on my channel, I'm very positive. I never negatively talk about anybody, but I see so many courses out there that are just video demos and there's no practice. And I'm like, that is the worst waste of money for anybody who ever wanted to learn to code, to just watch something and not do it.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. When I'm sort of the resident non-coder at Leanpub. I mean, I do some programming, talk about software all the time and stuff like that. But it's one thing I've noticed I think the best kind of coder we ever had on our team, it was really interesting actually. Like back we're work from home now, but there was a time when we had an office and he would code in these like crazy bursts.
Mm-hmm.
You could hear it on the keyboard. And he developed this facility for just like incredibly fast typing. When the thought occurred to him, he could just get it all out. One thing we do with if someone's going to stick around for a while, we sort of tell them to go learn Dvorak. For example, and so for anyone listening, like this is you look at your keyboard and it probably says QWERTY on it, like QWERTY, but there's people who've done sort of, science on things about how to efficiently type. And there's different configurations of where the letters and numbers and stuff are going to be. And Dvorak is one of those. And it's sort of very interesting because you actually have to kind of relearn how to type, like your fingers know where they want to go. Right. And then you have to consciously think about it. You have to step back, and it's incredibly frustrating if you're a coder. It's like, oh no, or a writer, like now you actually have to think about where your fingers are going, and it takes some time. And it takes an investment of time, but once you come out the other end, your fingers are going to know where they're going again. But you're going to be faster. And there's this physical element to learning to code anyway, which is what I'm sort of gesturing at, that I think often gets left out, and definitely would get left out from just watching videos.
Yeah. And it's something in the book, and it's something I encourage my Skill Foundry students to do who are in my community, is the whole experience of journaling is a big one. A lot of people don't journal at all when they're learning to code or learning anything else. And, part of the power of journaling is not taking notes. Some people think that yes, you should take notes. You should summarize the information as you're going through it and reading my lessons and watching the videos. You should absolutely do that. But journaling is another step. Journaling is at the end of your learning session, writing down things. How did you feel? Explain the topics in your own words without looking at the notes. Can you do that? Can you break it down? Can you do it in your own words? If you can't, then you didn't learn the material. You need to go back and review it. Like, and too many people just kind of treat courseware as like school. Like, I'm going to check the box. Hey, I skimmed the lesson, check the box, that lesson's done. Is it? There's ways you can test yourself, and journaling and note taking are ways to do that. And your guy on your team who would just suddenly burst. That's another big common mistake that beginner coders make, is they jump right into the code. You have to think, then you code, because coding is an expression of a solved problem. So when you write working code, you have solved a problem. So if you don't understand how to solve the problem, if you can't describe that process, you can't write the code. It's impossible. So a lot of, when I get new people into Skill Foundry, a lot of it is, all right, you're going to outline these assignments. You're going to write pseudocode. You're not going to write actual code. You're going to describe to me step by step how you're going to solve this problem. And then you write the code. And the ones that do that do not only do infinitely better, but also as a mentor, when you're trying to help somebody who's learning to code, you can look at their outline and say, okay, you have a fundamental misunderstanding right here that we need to fix so that you can get on with writing the code and solving the problem.
This is a very specific question, and I'm going to ask you a question about job interviews, basically. So you've obviously interviewed a lot of people throughout your career for various roles at various levels and things like that. And is that skill that you're describing now, like, being presented with a problem, being to explain what you're going to do with the code? Is that more like interview level kind of like appropriate? Is that a good skill to have in interviews, basically?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Because when you're in an interview and you're under pressure, I mean, everybody who's sitting across the table understands that you're nervous, and they understand that this isn't a standard situation. Because, I can always be a smart ass in the interviews that, because they'll ask you something that's kind of trivia, and I'd be like, well, I'd look it up, I know where to find that information. But if you explain your thought process and how you approach a problem, so like when you go to the whiteboard or when you're sitting at the keyboard, just talking aloud about your thought process to the interviewer, it tells them so much about what you know. And it gives them so much more information about where your skill levels are at. Because if you just sit there quietly and just type some code, they don't know what's going on in your head. And if you make a mistake, they might think that, you don't know what you're doing, when in fact you just can't remember that particular function. But you can be like, hey, I know that there's a function that does this. I think it's this. I think this is how it works. I'm going to try to do this. And what I really want to see in interviews is your debugging thought process, because most code that people have to deal with in a professional setting is code that other people have written. And being able to look at code, diagnose what's going on, go through the scientific method of debugging and do that aloud will build an interviewer's confidence that you genuinely know what you're doing. So yeah, that's a great interview tip. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you bring up sort of also the possibility of being in an interview and sort of like not knowing the answer or not having it occur to you. And reminds me of a friend of mine who worked for Goldman Sachs years ago told me that this, I don't know if this is true anymore, but at the time they notoriously it's a very hard company to get a job at. And you would have to go through dozens of rounds of interviews. And one specific thing they would do is there would be an interviewer. What they would do is they pushed you until you couldn't answer.
Yeah. And
the point was to see, what do you do in a high pressure situation when you don't know the answer? It was just very interesting that these are the kinds of challenges that people, when they're looking for how you think, it's not just do you know this function or do you know this sort of piece of trivia? It's what do you do when you hit that wall? And that's just very interesting when you're left to how resourceful are you? What do you say? Well, then if this weren't an interview, but it were a real situation, then I would do this or that. It's sort of interesting to think about those sort of things too, the things you kind of literally can't prepare for because they push you till you're not prepared.
Yeah, I used to do that in my interviews because you want to find the boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to do the progressively harder questions until they started struggling, and now I know where you are. That's very, very common in interviews. And going back to the journaling as part of my recommendations, when you're journaling and you're writing what you learned in your own words, what do you think you're doing there? You're preparing for the interview.
Right. Yeah.
Because nobody, in coding, there's a concept inheritance. And every textbook in the world uses vehicle, car, truck. And if you sit down in an interview and you use the textbook examples, you're not going to do well. You need to be able to pull examples from the things you've built and be able to describe the stuff around it. Why did I use this? Here's a project that I used it in. Here's what I did. Here's what I struggled with. Here's what I learned. That's what, especially at the junior levels, that's what your interviewer wants to talk about, not, can you spew out the textbook example of this technical term?
And so we brought it up. You brought it up before, but what's spacing?
Yeah, spacing is basically when you learn something and you practice it, you need to come back after a period of time and do it again. And that's something, if you've ever trained for sports or anything like that, do you do dribbling exercises every day? No. Do you do dribbling exercises progressively throughout the month? Yes. And that's something that's just really important in learning. You need to come back and reinforce the things that you learned before, because if you don't use it, you're going to lose it.
So an example from coding, would that be like let's say I'm learning a new programming language and I set myself a task build a clock.
Sure.
Is it then go do it again a month later? Would that be an example of that?
I would probably say it's more like using the same concepts. Okay. So if I learn about arrays, then I'm going to do some practice exercises with some arrays. And then 2 weeks later, I'm going to come back and I'm going to do some different exercises, but using arrays. Now, the nice thing about coding is that space repetition kind of happens naturally, because everything in coding builds on top of the fundamentals. So as you're practicing the fundamentals, as you build more and more applications, you're going to get space repetition on those things. But if there is something that's kind of niche, security and login or something like that you're trying to learn, then yes, you're going to need to deliberately go and do that over time until it becomes second nature. I kind of talk to people about, if you're out in nature and you have a dirt path going through a field, and nobody walks on that field, what happens?
Right.
The plants all come back and it goes away. So you have to walk those pathways. And even when you're first learning, because you start from the field and you need to cut that path through. So you need repetition a lot early on. And once the pathway is established, then you don't need to do it as often. But if you don't do it at all, eventually it will become overgrown, and you might remember that there's a path there and kind of where it goes, but you're not going to be effective at walking it. And that's just kind of the best metaphor I can think of.
Yeah, no, I really like that one. I really like that one. That's really good. And one can expand on that too. Like, what if there's like spiders over there? Oh, I'm going to avoid that. I'm going to avoid that part of the path, that part of the field, because I don't like spiders. And it might be like, but maybe your job is actually going to entail, dealing with those spiders from time to time. So you actually have to kind of think about your emotions, which is something you write about in the book as well. Like there's this type of thing that I really hate doing, and I'm always trying to avoid it. And then thinking about, oh no, here it comes, my discomfort with this task, but I just need to do it anyway, and just accept that I'm going to be uncomfortable with it, maybe forever, or maybe until I've done it enough that I'm not uncomfortable with it anymore.
Yeah. And as the book says, some of those, I'm glad you brought up the emotions and things like that in their journaling. Like I always encourage my students, like, log the time of day, log what you've eaten, log how your sleep went. Because all of those things, when you get to the end of the week and you're like, well, how did things go this week? And you're like, oh, this week did not go very good. Well, can you find patterns? Did you not sleep enough? Were you consuming a lot of sugars or something that spiked your glucose, and then you had crashes, and then you weren't as effective? Your body is very much involved in learning, and that's something I think a lot of people don't really think about. They think it's purely brain based, but your brain greatly benefits from proper nutrition, proper sleep, proper exercise. So you got to train the whole body, if you want to get the maximum value out of it.
One question that's come up on this podcast a number of times, because so many Leanpub authors are or were programmers at some point in their career, is if you were starting out now in 2024, let's say you just graduated high school, I guess, would you go to university and get a computer science degree, like a full 4-year degree, or would you choose another path?
I think enough companies still require the piece of paper that I would probably still get a technical degree. Now I got 2 children. They're 18 and 19.
Oh,
so they just went. The younger one is going through this process right now, and the older one is already in it. But my pessimistic market-based advice to them was, if you're not going to go to an Ivy school, then get the cheapest degree you possibly can that gets the job done, because you don't want to be saddled with the debt. And that's what, and it's a struggle for me, because I have a master's degree. I'm a big fan of education, and I think that higher education has a place and will continue to have a place. But right now, the cost value is not aligned. And I'm very curious to see what's going to happen about that, especially as employers start moving to more skills-based hiring instead of degree-based hiring, which is a trend we are seeing. And we are seeing apprenticeships and things coming up. And, it's an unpopular opinion probably among the IT folk, but I actually think that most IT roles are actually blue-collar, and they should be treated like blue-collar apprenticeship, journeyman, master, and you should be mentored into those parts of the field. We need the higher educated research scientists to build the tools and give us all the fancy things, but I've never really seen the difference between somebody who's just writing code for a company and an electrician. Like, I think those roles are, conceptually very similar, versus an electrical engineer and an electrician. They have a lot of overlap in the knowledge, but their jobs are very different. And I think that's true in IT. I just don't, I don't know if we're going to catch up to that, or if that's going to change, or.
It's very interesting. You brought up a lot of very important and sensitive points in your very good answer. my personal take on it is that if you can afford it, in terms of time and money, spending 4 years in your youth in formal study at an institution will change your life for the better. Your whole one life you've got, the rest of it for the better. There's sort of like one sort of funny thing I like to say is like, you won't have naive respect for doctors and lawyers if you've been to university, because you will have friends who are doctors and lawyers.
Yeah.
And that's not to be discounted as a sort of like an important feature to have, an experience to have in your life. I mean, you might be the doctor or lawyer yourself too, which is great. Both of which actually do currently require you going to university. But there's just so much else that you learn in that experience, in that time, besides what ends up sort of directly playing a role in your profession later, that if you can afford it. And it's also a very good point that you make as well about like, but if you can get into a brand name, university, that gets your foot in the door the rest of your life, as well, as unfair as that can seem. It's definitely the case. That's very curious what you say about, treating sort of coding jobs as blue collar or something like that, because, I've met a lot of people who like naturally approach it that way. Even if they've been to university, they're like, you can tell it from the way they talk about their electives, for example, they're not there to get an education, or even in a sense, become a professional.
Right. They want to learn a skill. And at the end of the day, I mean, when you get hired by a business, they're paying you to build things and solve problems. They're usually outside of Microsoft and Google and, the big FANG companies, which have positions that are research related. Mm-hmm. There's very few IT jobs that are not vocational in nature when you really break it down.
And so actually that leads me to ask a question that hasn't come up so much on the podcast, but probably should have more. What role do you see AI kind of taking in that kind of jobbing programmer kind of space in the next, say, 5 years? Like if someone's making this big decision about what they want to do for their career, should they be doing that?
Yeah. I mean, to start with, I've got some videos on my channel about AI. I've talked about it quite a bit. I'm not concerned. Being an older guy, I mean, when I first started coding, I had a Orland Turbo C book that was this thick. And if you wanted help, you had to go to a use group, basically, on a dial-up modem and post your question and just hope that a human would get back to you. And over the last, 30 years, we've had such advances. We have IntelliSense, we have autocomplete, we have all these frameworks, we have all these resources on the internet. I can write code probably 20 times faster than I could back when I was getting started, just because of the tools. And as the tools have evolved and as productivity has increased, the number of developers worldwide has also increased. So it bears to say that as software gets cheaper and easier to produce, the world demands more software. Now, is AI going to get to a level where it can replace a senior coder? I don't think so. I'm not seeing that today. I'm kind of seeing the capabilities of AI plateauing. But even if it could, there's going to be a lot of jobs for people who understand tech, who can prompt it, who can check it, who can, maybe your workflow changes now. Maybe I don't need to write all of the CSS for this website. Maybe I can just have that generate it. I can check it. I can tweak it, and we're off to the races. And I think that's a very exciting place to live. I mean, going back to my earlier desire to be in game development when I was a kid. Well, if I had an AI companion that could shorten the learning process for me to get into developing games, I will absolutely do that in retirement, and I will be excited about it because it means I'll be able to create more useful software than I could before. So I'm excited about the possibilities, but there is some fear mongering. Like, it is definitely overblown. It is not good. I use it, or at least I try to use it frequently because I just want to keep tabs on it. And it's good at simple things. It's good at things that it has a lot of data on. I think, and that's where, when I'm talking to my students at Skill Foundry, I really encourage them to get in and really learn the fundamentals so that they can be broader, more skilled developers. Because I think if you're somebody who just learns like one front end framework, like React, for example, you're not really a software developer at that point. You're a React developer. And because that stuff is very templated, that is something that AI will probably be able to do a lot of, in the next 5 to 10 years. So if you don't have a broader base of knowledge and you don't really know how systems work, I don't think the future looks as good for you. I'm not panicking yet because it's a long ways off, but I don't like your long-term prospects if you're not kind of a broad foundation-based person who understands how systems come together.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. I mean, I guess it's always been true, but like if your work isn't based on understanding what you're doing and just knowing which buttons to push in what order,
right,
you're replaceable. Ultimately, whether it's by someone who's faster at it than you are or a machine, but actually understanding the fundamentals of something is just very important. If we are concerned about that kind of being a problem for you at some point, understanding the fundamentals of how things actually work is kind of the best thing you can do to address that worry. The last thing I wanted to ask you about your book, and you brought it up a couple times, is mentorship. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, a good mentor is somebody who can empathize with the learner, meet them where they are, and basically get them to a place of understanding. And a lot of people just aren't suited for mentorship, and that's okay. I don't think anybody out there who doesn't want to mentor or doesn't have the patience or the tolerance for it, I don't think they should feel like they should have to mentor. But when you're a learner, I can't think of anything you would ever learn that would not be more effective if you did it on your own instead of having a mentor. I mean, can you think of any skill that wouldn't benefit from having a human with experience right there beside you? Cooking, sports. I mean, I can't. I mean, even like meditation, that's a solo activity. You usually have a guru or somebody who puts you on the path, right? I mean,
yeah, it's true. I guess the one thing I guess I would be philosophy.
Yeah.
Which might sound like the opposite, but like it's so, you have to go through it yourself.
Yeah.
It is fundamentally something you have to go through yourself. And yeah, I don't think that really tackling the deep problems of philosophy is not something that you should have a mentor for.
Yeah.
That's
good.
Sorry for taking your question so seriously.
No, I'm going to speak about it because
me like, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's things like that where you shouldn't be wanting a mentor, but definitely almost everything else.
Almost everything.
And definitely, I mean, this is something like, I mean, since I never had it, I kind of did, I guess, but like in terms like there's learning something, like say learning coding, but there's if you're going to be having a career as an employee for companies or as a founder of things, absolutely 110%. Having people around you who've done it, who know it, who are like in networks of other people who know it and do it, absolutely, like incredibly important.
Well, and especially at the beginning, because there's so much information. I mean, even Leanpub, I mean, how many coding books are there? They all have something to offer. They're all, good quality books. But if somebody who doesn't know anything about programming is looking at the catalog, where do they start? What's useful for them? What's their career goals? How does that align with that? Like, there's all these questions about how to get into the coding and how to get into the career path and what are the pros and cons. And a mentor will really, really help you with that.
The example that brings to mind for me is a friend of mine who he was the first person. He grew up in a very small town in Saskatchewan, the province in Canada that I'm from, and like he realized, like, he was on an escalator in one of the, department buildings his first week at university, and he realized there's more people on this escalator than in my town. And he was the first person in his family on either side ever to go to university. And he just thought that he'd made it. So all he did was party, and that he didn't go to class for months. and then halfway through the year, he got the kind of like finger wag letter from the university saying, if you don't shape up, we're kicking you out for a year. Right. And it was then that he realized, oh my God, I actually have to go to class. Like I actually have to take tests and stuff. Like he really didn't know that. And like, I always bring that up as a kind of stark example. If he'd had one person in his life who he could have just talked to for 10 minutes,
right.
Like who'd gone through it, who knew about it, who could explain, no, at university, you have to go to class. You're not just ticket to a middle-class job. You actually have to learn things and take tests and get grades and submit essays and stuff like that. And there's like things like that like the rest of us, especially if we're a bit older and we've been around the block a few times, we kind of totally take for granted. But there can be people who are just completely new to something. And if you're completely new to something, find someone who knows about it.
Well, I mean, a good example, they call that expert blind spot, where if you know something, you don't think that other people don't know it. And it bit me a couple of years ago. I was designing a training program for beginners. I don't only have my own brand, I also build courseware for like Fortune 500 companies. I built a computer science program for a university. So I do a lot of freelance stuff on the side. But we were building this beginners program, and I just assumed that everybody knew how to access the file system on a computer. Because growing up, I mean, I don't know how old you are. You don't need to share that with your viewers. But when I was growing up, I mean, you had to know the file system because you were putting physical disks into the computer and you had to navigate the files and everything like that. And I realized as we got in with the younger crowd that they have iPhones and they have iPads and the iPhone hides all the files and directory structure from you. So I had a subset of students who had never opened a file explorer before. They didn't know what a directory really was. They knew what a folder was, but they didn't, and it's just all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, all these assumptions that I have about basic computer things that I grew up with, just not a thing for the younger crowd.
Yeah, that's a to people of our vintage, that is a stark a stark thing to face.
Well, I just did a video on hosting because cloud, everything is cloud, and I noticed that a lot of my Skill Foundry students thought that you had to use the cloud to host your websites, and I'm like, no, you can buy a shared host, you can set it up on your own machine, and we started talking about that, and I sensed this intimidation that they were like, oh my gosh, this looks really hard, really complicated. And I realized that the kids these days, they have Steam and they have PlayStation Network. And when they want to play with a friend, they just click the button and it just kind of works. When I was young, we had to physically pick up our PC, take it to somebody's house. We had to wire them all together. We had to configure the network. And we by virtue, we ended up learning about IP addresses and hosts and how, DNS worked and things like that. And the younger generation, they haven't had that experience. And there's just so many things like that. When you are an educator, when you are a writer or a content creator, you have to really step back and think about, am I making assumptions about things my audience knows that they won't know? And that's expert blind spot.
Yeah, I know that's very good, and a great segue into the last part of the interview where we talk about your experience as a content creator, and in particular, in your case, creating content for learning. And that you need to be aware of the sort of blind spots that the person learning might have, but also your own. You've got this great, just example of, you've got these great videos, you've got this great PDF book that you've made and things like that. What was your approach to writing the book?
So, well, first I identified the problem. And the problem was I keep coming across students who aren't studying properly and don't understand truly how deep knowledge kind of is acquired. So first you kind of define your problem space, And then you define your avatar. So who is my target audience? What do they look like? What kind of opinions and emotions do they hold? And a lot of that was doing research on Reddit. I hang around Reddit sometimes, as little as I can, to be honest, but I do frequent there because there's a lot of people, and you start seeing the same kind of questions asked over and over and over in some of these subreddit forums. So I think Reddit is really good for research because you can really see what people are saying in the issues that they're having. And from that, you build your customer avatar, you build your problem, and then you just build backwards. So if I want somebody to end up in this end state where they are an effective learner, what do they need to do and what do they need to understand? And that's kind of what built the outline. And then from there, it's just sitting down and grinding out that writing, man.
So that sitting there and grinding it out, that's the part that I really like talking to people about, because it's usually such a sort of personal thing. So, did you have like a kind of, was it like every evening you told your family, like, for the next 6 months, I'm going to be in that room, don't bug me for 2 hours every night? Was it Saturday afternoons? Was it Sunday?
Yeah, I set aside time. But I think one of the mistakes a lot of people make, because I'm an entrepreneur too, so I interact with business owners, content creators, I interact with all these types of people. The ones that are successful, when they start their day, they do the hardest thing first. So whatever it is in your day that you don't want to do, that's what leads to procrastination. You do it first. You do it first thing in the morning. If I wake up and I'm like, I don't really like, sometimes in my writing or like there's a lesson, like, it's just a technical example in C#, there's this framework called Entity Framework, and I don't like it, but a lot of people use it, so I have to teach it. So when I got to the point where I had to write the Entity Framework lessons, that was the first thing I did in the morning. And I'm like, I'm not allowed to do anything else, anything that's fun or enjoyable that I want to do until I work on these Entity Framework lessons. So I think that really helps people a lot if they structure it like that. Like, pick the thing you don't like, do it first, and then all of a sudden you're free to do other things.
Yeah, I like that. I really like. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone articulate it quite that way, but that's a really good idea, and I like the idea because it forces you to reflect on that. There are things that I don't like doing.
Yeah,
what are they? Even if you don't do them first, but just like actually just going through that step seems like it's very useful, and like, understanding that, the reason I'm not doing that is because I don't like it. Like I said earlier in the analogy of like the part of the field with the spiders in it or something like that.
Yeah.
There's going to be things you don't like, and being aware of what they are is very helpful, and you can use tactics like that.
And when you have money, so if you're working, if you have extra money, consider outsourcing those things. Luckily, I hold a full-time job and I get my revenue from my various sources, but I can tell you, I will happily pay somebody to do things that I don't like to do. So, as you become, that's your goal. I mean, I think that's most people's goal when they want to start their own businesses and do things like that, is to maximize your freedom. So, as you get that revenue coming in, start outsourcing the things that you don't like to do so that you only get to work on the things you do like to do.
Yeah, it's there's a guy who's very popular on YouTube called Alex Hormozi, who's got these videos about building businesses and stuff like that. And I don't remember him. I watched a series of them, and I don't remember him talking so much about what you like and don't like, but he definitely said, like, if you've got a business process, do it yourself until you understand it well enough to explain it to other people. Make it an inherently profitable process, and then pay someone to do it.
Yeah.
And this is one of the sort of basic approaches to entrepreneurship is accepting. It can be like, it's easier said than done, though. Like, it can be it can actually be hard. That sounds like, oh wow, who wouldn't want to do that? But it can actually be hard to hand off things, which is something that you have to learn as well. And then you have to learn the skill of managing those things that you've handed off and things like that. And things just kind of get harder in a different way to some extent. But I do really like that advice. If you do have the resources to hand off something that you don't like doing to other people, hand it off. Just do it. The last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest has published a book on Leanpub, is if when you were interacting with Leanpub, there was one thing that had you shaking your fist, damn you Leanpub, why does this suck so bad? Or if there was some magical feature we could build for you, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
I thought it was really smooth. I'm a tech guy, so I like the minimalist kind of approach. I thought it was really the thing that slowed me down the most probably was just because it was my first time, was just the glossary, like just trying to figure out like what these terms meant.
Oh yeah.
And I think like one of them, you talked about, there's a thing on there for a community edition. Right. That if somebody, you'll give this to them if they sign up for a membership or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there was a lot of examples of how that actually worked. Now I'm on ConvertKit for Skill Foundry.
Right.
And I started thinking about, oh, well, that would be cool if they signed up for my newsletter through ConvertKit. Maybe I could get them over here and get them the thing. But it ended up like, I'm so busy staring down that rabbit hole. I was like, no, I'm not going to do a community edition. It seems like a good idea, but I was like, I don't have time for that.
That's very interesting. Yeah, you got me thinking. I mean, some kind of, because we do have a kind of visual introduction, like basically like help center article / blog post for people, where it's kind of like, because a lot of authors, the problem they have is like Leanpub is there for people to discover and buy and read books and courses and things like that, but it's also for people to create and publish them. And sometimes it can be like, how do I get back to the author part of it? Kind of thing can be tricky. But and the thing is, it's interesting having a kind of not so much visual, but just a glossary is something we don't have, where it's just, what are the key terms? If I'm going to be an author and I'm going to be interacting with Leanpub, can you save me time by like, it's going to be annoying, I'm going to have to spend 10 minutes reading something. But like, if I actually have somewhere I can go, or if I come across a word in a help center article or something like that, or I'm watching an explainer video and something is mentioned, is there a place I can go? And then hopefully that would build that out with links to articles and stuff like that. So that's something I'll think about doing, because I think that would be really helpful. You also, as you know, you don't want to make things appear too daunting either, and have people, I got to read the manual. Damn, no, I'm out.
Well, and I don't know how many of your other authors are like multi-creators like me, where I have the courseware and the YouTube and all that stuff, but I'm always looking for ways to do that, because I have my audience and my students, and I'm like, well, how do I feature my Leanpub cleanly on my website? Like, do I just put a link to it? Is there a better way to integrate that? Or, I don't know. That's kind of,
yeah. I mean, there's
it wasn't a problem. I loved my Leanpub experience.
Right.
I'm just saying, like,
there's
a struggle for me as a multi-channel content creator is utilizing all my audience from all the channels and figuring out how to do that effectively. Is probably my biggest pain point in my business right now.
That's very interesting. And that's something that we should probably provide some guidance for as well. It's something that comes up. I mean, in the self-publishing world, for example, the self-publishing blogosphere is full of basically people addressing these issues, right? Like, so now I've got my Substack, but I've also got my books, but I've also got my videos, but I've also got my webinars, but I've also got my email, maybe my separate email newsletter and stuff like that. And how do I get it all to kind of hang together? But then now you've got to understand the terminology of all these different platforms that you're using and things like that. And so, for example, on Leanpub, which is like, we actually have a lot of features and things like that. So, for example, a community edition. Well, what's that? Well, a community edition of a book is a subset of a book that people can get for free. But you, as the author, can sort of say, hey, in order to get this for free, you need to give me something like your email address or something like that, which I can then use to contact you and put you on an email newsletter list or something like that. That was something that was drawn out of us exactly by people like saying what you were saying, right? Where they're like, when I want to be able to use my content to build my contact list of people and build my audience, give me a way to do that. So
now, where does that email go? Because that's where I stopped. I was like, okay, you got this community edition. They have to give me something so I can ask for their email. Where does the email go? Does it live only on Leanpub? Because I need it in ConvertKit.
So
you see what I'm saying?
I know exactly
that's where I fell down. That's where I pieced out because I didn't have time.
I know exactly what you mean. I actually don't know the answer to that. What I can say is that it will live on Leanpub somewhere in what we call the author app, like the author side of things. I'm going to make an article today about that, just so I know the answer. But but I can tell you an example of how things work with another feature. So when you create a book on Leanpub, even before you publish it, you have a wet landing page for the book. And that page has an interested readers kind of section on the top right. And so what people can do there is they can enter their email address and they can say, notify me when this book is published. So that list, there's a list that is only known to Leanpub, and that's people who don't opt in to share the email address with the author. Right. But on that form, people can tick a button to share their email address with the author. So if you go to your book in Leanpub, you've got an interested readers page that you can go to from your overview page, and that's where you'll find the list. And it's just basically like a bullet pointed list of email address that people have shared with you. But there's and we do have an integrate with MailChimp feature.
Okay.
That is old, but we don't have an integrate with ConvertKit thing for that list, and I don't think we have either of those things for wherever the email address goes. But it will be on Leanpub viewable only by you in your account, and maybe your co-authors. And it'll be associated with the book. So I've got an article to go write. Nice. Well, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to talk to me and to talk to all of us. And thanks for the great interview, and thanks for using Leanpub as a platform for your book. We really appreciate it.
No, it's a really great platform. So thank you.